The sun barely touched the ground beneath the towering trees of the elven city, their silver leaves shimmering in the faint light. Cal Verin, the human, worked silently beneath the watchful eyes of his elven overseers. His hands, calloused from years of hard labor, moved swiftly as he carried stone after stone, stacking them along the edge of the royal gardens. The elves had always watched him with disdain, their tall, slender forms gliding effortlessly through the air, their ice cold and unforgiving. To them, humans were little more than tools, short-lived creatures meant for toil, not for thought. But Kale wasn't like the others. He had a mind that worked faster than any of the elves could guess. He learned the patterns of the elven guards, noticed the smallest mistakes, and quietly began to gather his thoughts. He wasn't just a laborer. He was waiting for the right moment. The stonework of the gardens was beautiful, designed with delicate carvings that told stories of ancient battles and forgotten kings. But Kale didn't see beauty. He saw weakness. The elves had built their world around perfection and beauty, but they had never learned the power of survival. Humans were stubborn, relentless, and resourceful. In the silence of the gardens, Kale let his mind wander to thoughts of the past, of the old world where humans ruled and the elves were nothing more than an unknown race hidden in the shadows. He thought of his father, a once proud warrior, now nothing more than a whisper in the wind. His mother had died in the streets, her life taken by the elves when they first came. That had been years ago, but the memory burned like a fire. It was the fire inside him that never went out. Today, Kale felt it again. The pull, the urgency. It came when he least expected it, but he couldn't ignore it. The Emberstone, hidden deep in his cloak, pulsed with energy. A powerful force, older than the elves themselves. No one had known its true power, not even the elves, who believe humans to be ignorant and powerless. They didn't understand what Kale had discovered. He took a moment, standing still, eyes drifting toward the elven city in the distance. The grand spires of gold and silver, shining with magic, looked so perfect from afar. But Kale had seen behind the beauty. He knew its cracks. He had spent years watching, learning, and waiting for this moment. Today, he would act. The elves had underestimated him. They had underestimated all of them. With a quiet breath, Kale turned and slipped into the shadows, his footsteps silent against the soft earth. Today, the elves would learn the cost of their arrogance. The spark had been lit, and it was only the beginning. Kale's feet moved swiftly through the narrow alleyways of the elven city. The once vibrant colors of the streets, filled with glimmering lights and delicate carvings, now seemed dull to him. Every step he took felt like a beat of something far larger than just his own plans. He had been working in the royal gardens for weeks, quietly watching, learning, and now it was time to make his first move. The Emberstone pulsed softly beneath his cloak, a reminder of the power he had discovered. He hadn't yet fully understood the depth of its magic, but he felt its energy each time he touched it. It was a connection to something ancient, something that the elves didn't even know existed. He could feel its presence, guiding his every thought. Today, he would strike without violence. Today, he would strike with cunning. Kale moved to the marketplace, where elves wandered freely, their delicate hands gathering fruits, herbs, and rare spices. The humans in the city had been tasked with the menial jobs, cleaning, cooking, carrying, all under the watchful eyes of elven masters. They were expected to be invisible, to remain unnoticed, and to never question the elves' rule. But Kale was different. He had learned the art of patience. He had learned how to be invisible and still powerful. Kale passed a group of humans, his eyes flicking over them. He could feel their nervousness, their quiet hopelessness. They had accepted their place under the elven rule. But Cal couldn't. Not anymore. He glanced at a vendor, a young human woman who was struggling with a basket of apples. The elven overseer standing nearby was too distracted to notice Cal's subtle gesture. With a swift motion, He nudged a small crate of vegetables into the path of the overseer, who stumbled forward in surprise, knocking over the woman's basket. The elven overseer turned sharply, his sharp eyes scanning the area. But Kale was already moving, blending into the crowd. He heard the elf shout angrily at the woman, but it was too late. The moment had been created. As the overseer scolded the woman, Kale slipped a small piece of parchment into the hands of a nearby human, a young man who worked as a clerk. The note was simple but carefully written. It contained just enough information to start the chain of events that Kale had planned. A simple distraction here, a small rebellion there. The city would start to notice. Little things would begin to change. A missing apple, a broken vase, a dropped coin. Nothing that could be immediately linked to anything bigger, but enough to get the elves looking in the wrong direction. Kale watched from a distance as the overseer scolded the woman, frustration evident on his face. It was only a small act, but it was a start. Cal's hands were steady. He felt the spark in his chest, like a match waiting to be struck. The elves might think humans weak, but they were about to learn otherwise. A new era was beginning. One where they would no longer hide in shadows, where their voices would no longer be silenced. The spark had been lit, and there was no going back. The days after the small sabotage in the marketplace were full of quiet tension. Kale moved through the streets as if nothing had changed, but inside, his mind was working quickly. The elves hadn't caught on yet, but he knew that wouldn't last. They were too proud, too certain of their superiority. It was only a matter of time before they noticed the small cracks that had begun to appear in their perfect world. The first sign of their frustration came when the elven guards began to patrol the streets more often. They watched the humans with narrowed eyes, their faces hard and suspicious. But Kale was ready for that. He had prepared for it. The Emberstone was always with him, its quiet hum guiding his actions. He had learned to listen to it, to trust its whispers. One evening, as Kale worked late in the gardens, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the royal courtyard. It was Lorraine, the elven historian he had seen before. She was always alone, keeping to herself, her eyes constantly scanning the world around her, as though searching for something. Kale had no idea why she seemed different from the others, but there was something about her that made him feel as if she could be useful to his cause. He approached her cautiously, keeping his footsteps light. "Lorraine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned sharply, her eyes wide in surprise, but she didn't run. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, as if weighing him carefully. "I know who you are," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "You're the one who's been making trouble. You're the one behind the disruptions." Kale nodded. "I am. But it's not just trouble. It's the beginning of something bigger." Lorraine looked around, making sure no one was near. "You're playing a dangerous game, human," she said, her eyes flickering to the shadows. "The elves won't let this go, if they find out what you're doing." "They'll try to stop me," Kale finished for her. "I know, but they've been too comfortable for too long. They don't understand what humans are capable of when we fight for something real." Lorraine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the palace, where the faint sound of voices and laughter could be heard. She seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to help or turn away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "Not all of us agree with the way things are," she said quietly. "The elves may think they rule, but I've seen what they've done to the humans. I've seen their cruelty. Maybe it's time for a change." Cal's eyes sharpened, his hope growing. "You'll help me then?" Lorraine nodded slowly. "I'll give you information. Small things at first. Maps, weak spots, places where they don't expect trouble. But you must be careful. The elves won't tolerate this for long. If they find out." "They won't," Kale interrupted, his voice confident. "They'll never expect a thing." As he walked away from the courtyard that night, Kale felt the weight of what he had started settle in his chest. He had taken the first step, and now, with Lorraine's help, the plan would move faster. The elves had no idea what was coming. The spark had turned into a flame, and it was only just beginning to burn. The moon hung high over the forest, casting a pale light through the twisted branches. The verdant labyrinth, an ancient forest forbidden even to the elves, whispered with life. Every leaf, every tree seemed to hold a secret, a forgotten truth. Cale stood at the edge of the forest, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had heard stories of the forest's power, how it could shift and change, how it could turn against those who dared to enter. But it was also the key to everything he needed. "Are you sure about this?" Lorraine's voice was quiet but urgent as she stepped beside him. "The forest doesn't welcome strangers, especially humans. We may never come back." Cale glanced at her, his eyes determined. "I'm sure. The Emberstone told me to come here. It's time to wake the old magic. It's time to stop waiting and start acting." Lorraine nodded, though doubt flickered in her eyes. She had agreed to help him, but the forest was different. She had always feared it, its power, its unpredictability. But Cale had changed things. Humans had been nothing but slaves for so long, and now they were rising up. She couldn't turn back. They stepped into the forest, the air growing cooler as the trees closed in around them. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. The deeper they went, the more it felt as though the forest itself was watching them. Cale could feel the pull of the Emberstone, its power growing stronger with every step. "Stay close," Lorraine whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "The deeper we go, the more dangerous it gets. This place has a mind of its own." Cale nodded but didn't slow his pace. He knew the risks, but he had no choice. The elves had taken everything from them. Now they would use the forgotten magic of the old world to fight back. They'd reached the heart of the forest, where a massive tree stood taller than any Cale had ever seen. Its bark was a deep, rich green, its roots twisted in strange patterns that seemed to pulse with energy. The air hummed with magic. Cale could feel it deep inside him, as if the very ground beneath his feet was alive. "This is it," Lorraine said softly. "The heart tree. It's where the old magic is sealed." Cale stepped forward, his hand reaching for the tree's bark. The Emberstone in his cloak seemed to burn with intensity, as if it recognized the power before him. With a deep breath, he pressed his palm against the rough bark. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the tree began to tremble. The ground shook beneath them, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Cale's heart raced, but he held his ground. The forest was waking up, responding to the call of the Emberstone. It was alive, and it was on their side. "Get ready," Lorraine warned. "The magic won't just hand itself over." The tree's bark began to split, revealing a glowing core deep within. Cale could feel its power, ancient and untamed, reaching out to him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The forest wanted to test him. It wanted to see if he was truly worthy. With a final push, the core of the tree exploded in a burst of light. Cale stumbled back, but he felt the energy rush into him, the power of the old world flowing through his veins. The forest had chosen him. Now, with this magic, they would fight back. The spark had turned into a fire, and it would burn through everything the elves had built. The sun had barely begun to set when Cale and his group reached the towering walls of Goldleaf Hold. The fortress loomed ahead, its smooth stone surface glistening in the fading light, almost as if it were an impenetrable wall of perfection. For years, the elves had thought of Goldleaf Hold as a symbol of their unshakable rule. It was a place where no human could ever set foot, a place where rebellion seemed impossible. But Cale was not like the others. He had the Emberstone, and the power of the verdant labyrinth flowed through his veins. "Tonight, we change everything," Cale whispered to his companions. His small army of humans, armed with makeshift weapons and the will to fight, gathered quietly in the shadows. They were no longer the weak, helpless workers the elves had once controlled. They were united, fueled by something far stronger than fear, hope. They had seen what they could accomplish, even with just a few small disruptions. But tonight would be different. Tonight, they would take the fight directly to the elves' doorstep. Cal's eyes scanned the walls of the fortress. The elves were proud and arrogant, but they had grown complacent. They trusted in their magic, their speed, their strength. What they didn't realize was that Cal had learned how to turn their greatest strengths into weaknesses. "Liran," Cal said quietly, turning to the elven historian. "The guards are positioned here, here, and here. Do you think you can create a distraction at the eastern gate?" Liran nodded, her face determined. "I can do it. The guards at that gate are the least experienced. I'll set the signal." With a final glance to make sure everyone was in place, Cal nodded. "Then let's begin." Liran moved swiftly through the shadows, slipping past the first set of guards with ease. As she reached the eastern gate, she stopped to check the timing. Cal's group, hidden just beyond the walls, was ready to strike as soon as the distraction began. Everything hinged on this moment. There was a soft hiss, a crackle of magic, and suddenly, the eastern gate exploded in a burst of light. The guards at the gate were thrown back by the force of the explosion. Chaos erupted throughout the fortress as alarms began to ring. The elves had never seen anything like this. They had relied on their magic and technology for centuries, but now it was being used against them. Cal motioned to his people, and they charged forward, their makeshift weapons raised high. The elves, still reeling from the explosion, were unprepared. They scrambled to defend themselves, but Cal's group was relentless. They had the element of surprise on their side, and they were not going to waste it. As Cal led the charge, he could feel the Emberstone's power pulsing within him, urging him on. It was as if the very earth beneath his feet was pushing him forward, giving him the strength to fight, to survive. He wasn't just fighting for his people anymore. He was fighting for a future where humans were no longer slaves, no longer beneath the elves. The battle was fierce, but the elves were unprepared for the strength and cunning of Cal's group. Goldleaf Hold, once thought to be invincible, was beginning to crumble. As the last of the elven defenders fell, Cal stood at the gates, breathing heavily but triumphant. Goldleaf Hold had fallen. The humans had taken their first victory. The spark had turned into a fire, and it was spreading. The night after the fall of Goldleaf Hold, Cal stood alone in the courtyard, staring out at the burning horizon. The smoke from the elven fortress drifted into the sky, a sign that things were changing. But Cal knew this was just the beginning. The elves would not let this defeat go unpunished. They had always been proud, and now they would be furious. The battle he had fought and won had opened the door, but it would take more than a single victory to turn the tide. Behind him, the small army of humans was resting, their exhaustion evident. They had been through a lot in the past few days, but they were eager for more. They could feel the shift in the air, the change that Cal had promised them. They had believed him when he said they could rise up. Now, they saw that it was possible. Liran stepped into the courtyard, her face serious. She had stayed behind in the castle to help organize the remnants of the elven forces. Despite the victory, she knew their troubles were far from over. "We've done what we needed to do here," Cal said without turning to face her. "But we can't stop now. They will come for us soon. We have to be ready." Liran nodded. "The elves will strike back with everything they have. They'll call upon their allies, summon more magic than we've ever seen. But I think they've underestimated us. They think we're just a few rebels, a few angry humans. They don't see the power we've awakened. Then it's time we show them," Cal said, his voice low but filled with certainty. He turned to face her, his expression firm. "We've proven we can beat them. We've proven that they're not as invincible as they think. Now we need to spread the message." Liran gave a small, grim smile. "That's exactly what I was thinking. We need to unite the other human settlements. There are more of us, and together we'll be unstoppable. Cal's eyes burned with determination. We'll make sure the entire world knows. The elves won't be able to hide behind their walls anymore. We'll take this fight to them. The plan was clear now. They would spread the news of Goldleaf-Hold's fall to every corner of the land. The humans, once scattered and broken, would rally to their cause. The spark had turned into a flame, and soon that flame would light up the entire continent. But Cal knew the road ahead would not be easy. The elves were not only powerful, but they were also clever. They would learn from their mistakes, and they would find new ways to fight back. Cal's group needed to grow stronger. They needed to be more than just a rebellion. They needed to be an army. With Lorraine's help, Cal began to make plans for the next step. The battle for freedom had just begun, and he would not stop until the elves knew they had made a grave mistake. The world was changing, and Cal could feel the shift in the very air. The humans would rise, and when the elves came, they would find that the fight was no longer one-sided. The tide was turning. The sun had barely risen when Cal and his group arrived at Ironcrest, a stronghold built into the side of a great mountain. The fortress, once a symbol of the elves' control over the northern lands, now stood as a challenge to Cal's growing movement. Ironcrest was heavily guarded, its tall stone walls covered in intricate carvings of elven glory. This was where the next fight would take place. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore," Cal said, standing at the foot of the mountain with his eyes locked on the fortress. "We're fighting to take back what's ours." Around him, the humans who had followed him from the fall of Goldleaf-Hold looked nervous but determined. They had come a long way since that night, and each victory had brought more people to their cause. But Ironcrest would be different. The elves had fortified their stronghold with powerful magic, and it was said that only the most skilled warriors could breach the walls. Lorraine, standing beside Cal, examined the fortress with a calculating gaze. "They won't let us in easily, but we don't need to fight them head-on. We need to draw them out." Cal nodded, already thinking ahead. "We'll hit the supply lines first, disrupt their food and resources. If we can starve them out, we'll force them to come to us." Lorraine's plan was risky but clever. The elves at Ironcrest relied on constant supplies of food and water that came from nearby villages. If Cal and his group could cut off those supplies, the elves would be forced to leave the safety of their walls to find new resources. And when they did, that was when Cal would strike. The first few days were spent preparing. Cal sent his best scouts to the nearby villages, making sure the supply routes were fully mapped out. At the same time, Lorraine helped him organize the human forces. More fighters joined with each passing day. The humans were no longer hiding in fear. They were standing tall, ready to fight for their freedom. As the final night of preparation arrived, Cal stood in front of his army. "Tomorrow, we attack. We show them that we're not just a handful of rebels. We are a force they can't ignore. We are humanity." The morning came quickly. The first part of the plan was to set fires along the supply routes, cutting off the elves' access to their critical resources. The elves, thinking the fires were simply a random event, sent out a small group of soldiers to investigate. It was the perfect distraction. With the elven soldiers focused on the fires, Cal led his group to the gates of Ironcrest. The attack was swift, but it was not the walls they would assault directly. Instead, Cal had his fighters place traps around the fortress, luring the elves into a carefully laid-out ambush. The elves took the bait, and soon their forces were scattered. Cal's group struck from all sides, using the cover of the mountain to stay hidden until the last possible moment. There were clashes in the narrow streets, the sound of steel meeting steel, and the shouts of both sides. The elves were skilled, but the humans had the advantage of numbers and strategy. At the heart of the fortress, Cal found the elven commander, a tall figure with piercing eyes and a cold, calculating expression. The battle was reaching its peak, and Cal knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. "Human," the elven commander said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You will never win. The elves are eternal." Kale didn't hesitate. Maybe, but we're fighting for something you'll never understand. With that, he charged. The fight wasn't easy, but it was one Kale couldn't afford to lose. The battle at Iron Crest raged on into the night, the clash of steel echoing through the mountain passes. Kale's heart pounded in his chest as he moved through the chaos, his every step fueled by the weight of his purpose. The elves had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. But this was only one fight. The elves would not give up so easily. They had their pride, their power, and they would fight until the end. Kale and his fighters pushed deeper into the fortress, cutting through the remaining elven defenders. The mountain walls seemed to close in on them, the narrow passages a constant reminder that there was no way out. They were trapped in the heart of the elven stronghold. But there was no turning back now. Kale had come too far. Ahead, he saw the elven commander, the one who had taunted him earlier. The commander stood tall, surrounded by his remaining guards, his face hardened with fury. He was a warrior through and through, his eyes sharp and calculating. Kale knew this fight would be different. "You think you can overthrow us, human?" The elven commander shouted over the din of battle. "We are the chosen, the eternal. You cannot defeat us." Kale's grip tightened on his sword, his resolve strengthening. "You've ruled with fear and lies for too long," he called back. "It's over. Your time is up." With that, he charged, his sword raised high. The elven commander didn't flinch. In an instant, the two clashed, their swords ringing out as they met. The commander was fast, his movements fluid and precise, but Kale had something the commander didn't: determination. The battle was fierce, each strike sending vibrations up Kale's arms. He could feel the elven commander's power, the years of training and magic that went into each blow. But Kale was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for his people, for a future where humans could stand on their own. With a swift maneuver, Kale blocked an attack from the commander and spun around, using the momentum to drive his sword into the commander's side. The elven leader let out a roar of pain, but quickly regained his stance. Kale could see the shock in his eyes. He had underestimated Kale's strength and resolve. "You are a fool," the commander hissed, blood dripping from his wound. "Even if you kill me, others will rise. The elves will never fall." Kale's eyes burned with fury. Maybe, but not today. With one final powerful strike, Kale drove his sword through the commander's heart. The elven leader's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The remaining elves, seeing their commander fall, hesitated, confusion spreading through their ranks. Kale took a deep breath, his body aching from the battle. He stood tall, his sword raised. "This is the end," he called to the remaining elven forces. "The humans will no longer bow to you. We are free." The elves, now without their leader, faltered. One by one, they dropped their weapons and surrendered, realizing that their reign was over. Kale stood victorious, but he knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. The elves were defeated, but the struggle for freedom had just begun. The humans would rebuild, stronger than ever, and Kale would lead them into a new future. The spark that had started it all was now a blazing fire, one that would never be extinguished. The fight was over, for now, but Kale knew that the world had changed forever, and humanity would never again be the underdog.